Thank you. Thank you, Roger. We're going to go through 3 points this evening, kind of working from a big overview through to looking at the differences in religion through to some of the claims of Christ. And after each one of those points, we're going to have a time of discussion. Hopefully you've seen on your tables, the questions will be on the screen as well. 3 questions in each of those discussion points. It's going to be pretty quick, and the questions may be quite big, so feel free to just look at one or work your way through them a little bit quicker, however that works for your table. Then I'll bring us back together as we move on to our second point. So, people often say all paths lead to the same God, and it sounds peaceful and inclusive, doesn't it? But when you actually look at the differences of what each religion teaches about God and about truth and about how to reach Him, the differences are pretty vast. This evening we're going to tackle 3 areas related to that question. Firstly, we're going to address the wider perspective on worldview and why this so often leads many to think along these lines of religious pluralism, where all paths lead to God. Secondly, I want to address the area specifically on religions and why they can't just all be different paths to the top of the same mountain. And thirdly, I'd like to give us a moment's thought towards the claims of Christ. Have you heard of the informal idiom, "you do you"? It's the encouragement for someone to be themselves and to follow their own judgment regardless of what others think and what others' opinions are in that area. The West is especially strong on this idea of individualism, which is the thought that we shouldn't interfere with anyone's beliefs as long as they don't harm others. Now, on the surface, people either see this as a nice thing to think, or they see it as an easier option because it avoids confrontation. This thought process is what has really shaped this often asked question, do all paths lead to the same God? Because at its core, it's not taking each religion's teaching at face value, but it's really appealing to the idea that everyone can just believe what they want and we should never challenge that. On the surface, again, it sounds quite good. You can see why it would appeal to many. But when you dive a bit deeper into the logical flow, we come up with some problems. We come up with some moral inconsistencies within it. Ultimately, we are saying that everyone can believe their own truth. It seems fine to an extent when we're generally looking at surface level aspects of world religion. But what about individuals or groups that would be labeled as fundamentalist or radical? The logical consistency of the argument that states that we should say you do you, but if that's not followed, if that argument isn't followed through, then what right does anyone have to stop another person's belief or action, no matter what extent it may go to? Well, often the way that we deal with it is we say, well, when someone harms another, that's when freedom stops. But what does that actually mean? Are we only talking about physical harm as the cutoff point for this aspect of morality for belief? What about emotional? What about mental harm to an individual? Jordan Peterson, in an interview on Channel 4, said, in order to think, you must risk being offensive. You can see the problem with the worldview that claims all paths ultimately lead to God. What is essentially being suggested is that it would be best for everyone to keep a surface level understanding of their beliefs, because it would make it easier for people to remain tolerant to one another. However, this approach only works if the deeper claims of each belief system are set aside and ignored. Once people begin to examine what different religions actually teach about God, about truth, and the way that we reach Him, those differences become far more significant. They are not small details, they are the core of what each faith is actually saying. You see, the problem is the worldview, the underlying thought says, stop thinking so you don't offend others. It's the same problem that we ultimately have with free speech. Free speech will naturally offend people, but so often free speech is stopped because it upsets others. You see, then that's limited speech, isn't it? It's not free at all in its nature. Look, hopefully you get this point. Our Western worldview's starting point is not actually dealing with the question of do all religions lead to the same God? It's actually dealing with a worldview problem, or whether we want to risk offending or being offended by truth despite its uncomfortable nature. Now, we have to accept there's different worldviews around us, isn't there? But we don't have to accept the truth of them or to somehow amalgamate them all together. Now, a common response to this argument is the accusation of arrogance. If not all paths lead to God, what we are saying is that some worldviews are right and some worldviews are wrong. And people often see the conclusion as inherently prideful or intolerant. However, when you think about it carefully, I would say the opposite can actually be more consistent and practical. If the goal is to reduce harm and offense in society, then actually seriously pursuing what is true becomes important. Finding the truth provides a foundation for setting meaningful boundaries over what is right and what is wrong. By contrast, if the priority is simply to avoid offense at all cost and avoid examining deep beliefs, the logical outcome is kind of an unrestricted freedom where every view must be treated as equally valid. No matter how bizarre, no matter how dangerous it may seem, in that situation, the definitions of right and wrong, they become unclear, they become unstable, and ultimately they make justice very difficult to uphold, and often they will lead to a society having more fractures and more divisions within it. In that sense, the pursuit of truth then, even when it leads to disagreement, is actually far more pragmatic because it allows societies to establish clear moral boundaries rather than removing them altogether. Ultimately, with this worldview issue, we need to be able to get to a point of saying respectfully, that is wrong. One other aspect I want to briefly touch upon before we take a few minutes of discussion is sincerity. Now, sincerity in any belief is important because otherwise we would be hypocrites within that belief system. But often, when we think about questions about all religion, the world tends to see sincerity as a substitution for truth. Once again, on the surface, it's a nice thought, isn't it? But ultimately, it's a fragile one. You can follow a recipe that you've been given with total sincerity, but if the instructions are wrong, the dish will still fail. A map can be drawn with care and honesty, but if it doesn't match the reality, it won't get you to where you need to go. You can sincerely believe a key is going to fit a lock, but if it's the wrong one, the door won't open. You see, sincerity, as much as it's important and as much as it can seem favorable, it does not supersede truth. So just for a few minutes, that's discussion 1, 3 questions there. Jump onto it in your tables. Have a look at some of those questions. Have a think about this idea of you do you, about worldview and how this plays into this idea of all religions leading to the same God. We'll have a few minutes on that before we jump back into our next topic. Well, let me draw you back in then. I'm sure there's some interesting conversations going on in relation to that topic. Well, hopefully we've concluded that there must be a pursuit of truth within this question of do all paths lead to the same God? So now we can look into what we mean then by all paths. And there are two questions I hope to draw our attention to. The first one is, aren't all religions much the same? And then the second one is, but don't they all lead to the same place? Aren't all religions much the same? On the surface, we can at least say they have some similarities. Often moral values and actions overlap in some ways, don't they? There is some concept of something spiritual within them, but I'd say that's sort of basically as far as we can go. Now, there are many religions and kind of worldviews and ideologies, but for tonight, I just want to consider those that have historically been the 6 major world religions, seen in Christianity, Islam, Judaism, Hinduism, Sikhism, and Buddhism. As a starting point, let's consider what each religion's view of God is. Well, Christianity, Judaism, Islam, and Sikhism all believe in a monotheistic God. They believe in one God. Hinduism takes a polytheistic view that there are millions of gods, and Buddhism believes there is no God, instead that there is a form of enlightenment for human beings. So right off the bat, in the very simplest way, we can say no. 3 of those religions are very much not the same as the others. Well, let's look at it from each religion's perspective on humanity then. Christianity says humans are created in God's image but fallen, needing redemption. Islam says humans are God's representatives on earth, naturally good but tested, responsible for obeying God. Judaism says humans are created in God's image with the capacity for good and for evil, called for ethical living and repairing the world. Hinduism says humans are divine at their core, but trapped in an illusion, aiming for spiritual growth and liberation. Buddhism says humans have no permanent soul, live with the suffering caused by desire, but they can reach enlightenment through wisdom and ethical living. And Sikhism says humans are equal, spiritually valuable, capable of great goods, but need to overcome ego to live in harmony with God. All 6 have a hugely differing perspective on the position of humanity. Each religion has a different understanding of who God is and what humanity is. And that's even before getting into the deeper questions about how salvation works, how belief systems actually move and are shaped, how works are meant to come about, and how our devotion is meant to look like. Because of that, saying all religions are basically the same, at best is just naive, and at worst is intentionally ignoring the real differences between them. Well, then, a second question posed is, but don't they all lead to the same place? The classic parable for this idea is that of the 6 blind men and the elephant. It goes like this. Once 6 blind men heard an elephant had come to town. Curious to know what it was, each of them went to touch the elephant. The first blind man felt the elephant's side and said, an elephant is like a wall. The second blind man touched the tusk and said, no, it's like a spear. The third blind man felt the trunk and said, you're wrong, it's like a snake. The fourth blind man grabbed the leg and said, clearly, it's like a tree. The fifth blind man held the ear and said, no, it's like a fan. And the sixth blind man touched the tail and said, it's like a rope. They began to argue fiercely, each claiming that his perspective was correct. And a wise man overheard them and said, all of you are right in what you felt, but wrong in your thinking that this is the whole truth. The elephant is much bigger, and your partial experience cannot fully reveal it. Religious pluralists who believe all paths lead to the same God often use this parable. But the problem is that the person observing the blind men is claiming that they can see the whole elephant. You see, it creates two issues. Firstly, they are claiming that they have a higher truth, which is ironic because it's exactly the same thing they are criticizing religions of doing. And secondly, they are making an exclusive claim that their view is correct, which leads to exactly the same accusation of arrogance that they place on religions themselves, that when religions say, I have the true path, they are doing exactly the same thing. You see, if we cannot place all religions under one category, then they are vastly different because each ones have these huge differences and these claims of being true. Then the real question is not how are they amalgamated together, but it's which one should we be looking at. Often the image of all religions going up a mountain from different sides to the same peak is used to represent this idea of religious pluralism. But a better image would be this idea of a maze. The routes often can look similar in some ways, but ultimately they are different, and all but one will lead to a dead end. Let's take a moment to discuss further. There's a number of questions in discussion point 2. Take a few minutes, look at those questions, discuss some of those thoughts. Just draw you back together. Hopefully we've gained some understanding of worldview and why this idea of an individualistic attitude or the idea that everyone can follow their own truth doesn't fully hold up. Hopefully we've also seen that not all religions can lead to the same outcome. They're diversely different. Each tradition has different truths that it holds to in a great way. Well, to finish, I want to look into the claim of Jesus that we read in John 14:6. It says, Jesus said, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Jesus' claim here is completely exclusive. He says, I am. It's a very intense way of referring to oneself. And Jesus is claiming a reference way back to the book of Exodus where God says, I am, about who he is. Those words reflect the very name of God. So the claim is intense. It is personal to God, and it creates without a doubt that Jesus' claim is that he alone is the way to the Father and ultimately to heaven. Jesus goes on to say he is the way, the truth, and the life. As he says the way, he's referring to a path, a road, a route. We've spoken about this image of all paths leading up the mountain. So Jesus' claim is that he is the way and not a way. And it immediately means we have to make a decision to either believe Jesus' claim or write him off completely. We can't just leave him as an option going up the mountain. He is either the only path or he is not a path at all. Jesus said he is the truth. And once again, truth is a claim that we've been looking at this evening. So if Jesus claims that he is the truth, then we cannot just place him in a framework of one of the truths. He is either correct in what he is claiming and the truth, or he is a liar. Lastly, he goes on to say, I am the life. Jesus' claim is that he brings life, not that he is an option to bring life, but that he alone brings life. His claims are inherently exclusive, defining the path and the truth in life. If that's true, then we must treat them not just as one of many religions and many options, but as an individual worldview that asserts truth definitively. We have to go and evaluate that on its own terms. And I want to briefly point out the claim that makes Christianity distinct amongst world religions. The Bible claims that it has a God who solves the problem. What's the one certain fact of life? Death. It's the one thing as humanity we cannot escape. It is inevitable for everyone. And all the religions point to something after death. And gaining that something, whether heaven or another word that it's given in one of the different world religions, means that what happens in this life now is important. Now, most religions have a moralistic goal. If you do more good than bad, you might reach the favorable place, the favorable afterlife. Well, this is appealing to many, isn't it? Because I think ultimately it gives people some sense of control. But it also diminishes the power, the holiness, and the justice of God. Reducing God's role to a calculation of human actions makes him seem limited, as if his judgment depends on works people have done rather than his perfect will. It undermines his distinct holiness because it suggests that humans can work their way up to him. It does one of two things. It either inflates human ability or it diminishes God's uniqueness. Finally, claiming God is just while admitting people into heaven simply because they are mostly good is not true justice at all. To be just, God must uphold his own standards. Ignoring sin would contradict his nature as a God of justice. The real problem, then, is ultimately the one that separates humanity from God. It's sin. It's not enough to try to work off our sin through good deeds. The separation must not be partially fulfilled. The separation must be fully resolved. And that's why Jesus said in John 14:6, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. Jesus, fully God, fully man, lived a perfect, sinless life. On the cross, he did the great exchange. He exchanged his perfection for our imperfection, his righteousness for our unrighteousness, once and for all. Because of this, we can stand before God on Judgment Day, and it won't be a matter of how good were you. What matters is whether you will be perfect through Jesus' sacrifice. In other words, salvation is not about moral tally marks. It's about being united with God through the blood of Christ. That's how justice and mercy meet, and how humanity can be restored to God. You see, that is the claim that is distinct in Christianity in comparison to all these other world religions that in the vast majority take this moralistic worldview. You know what? Just getting over the line, just being slightly better than you are bad, is not going to hack it when you're standing before a God of all holiness and justice and judgment. The only option is to be fully restored and have our sin fully resolved as we stand before him. And the only way that can happen is if Jesus' perfection is put on us and our imperfection is taken away. Third time of discussion then. There's three more questions looking at these claims of Christ. Take a few minutes, discuss them, have a think about them now. Let me just bring us all back together then for a final time. This topic of thinking through all religions and the claims of Christ is a big one, and I encourage us all to go away and reflect upon it more out of a sense of being ready to answer questions on it. Maybe you've got questions yourself. Maybe you're trying to work out in your own mind how these things fit together. Hopefully you've noticed that the tracks and things on your table, there's a specific one for this evening about this idea of kind of religious pluralism and all paths leading to God. So please take that away and reflect upon it. Maybe this has helped us think through things that we hadn't kind of come across before in different ways and just brought that to our attention to go away and reflect upon more. So I hope this has been helpful. Please continue these conversations this evening and beyond that as well. To close, we're gonna stand and we're gonna sing one more time. We're gonna sing In Christ Alone as our way to close together. So please let me encourage you to stand if you're able and to close in song.